So one of the probably the most important thing that I've learned about conversations about phones in schools is to have a level setting conversation about what are we talking about when we say phones.
Representative Mathias, how are you?
Senor Todd, I'm awesome.
Good.
As usual.
Good, man. We are hitting some of my favorite stuff today, which is kid safety, school safety, specifically as it pertains to cell phone and technology. You've been working with a lot of people, a lot of different parties at the table, PTAs, teachers, boards, the whole thing, to figure out, look, what do we do with this problem? Because it's a worldwide problem. And nationally, we have individual states that are starting to roll out different legislation and different solutions to the cell phone problem with kids in school. This is a huge problem, but you're tackling it. Talk to me about what you're doing.
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is that, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.
I always love being on the show. I love contributing to productive, adult conversations about important issues. And this is a beautiful one because it's so bipartisan. And that's why, issues of cell phone restrictions in particular as part of the school safety packages have been just rolling across the country. I've been talking to other people in our legislature about this issue, so I'm not the only one. But it's definitely, I have an 11-year-old, I have a 9-year-old, and I grew up, when if you wanted to have a private phone call, you had to take the phone, in the 20-foot cord, sneak into the pantry, close the door if you wanted privacy. So my understanding of phones is different. It's important. I mean, we're talking today on the day the iPhone 16 comes out. So one of probably the most important thing that I've learned about conversations about phones in schools is to have a level setting conversation about what are we talking about when we say phones. And I think there's an interesting, 5-part history pertaining to cell phones that are really important for people who want to be productive contributors to this conversation need to know. And
is one of the 5 that we never got the cell phone like they had in the Matrix that was like, and it snapped down because it wasn't a flip phone. They were like, kaboom, and they could like talk on it and then slap it back. Dude, that was such a slick phone. That was back when phones were phones.
Unfortunately, no, that is not part of the history. That is not part of the history. The parts of the history that are really pertinent to the conversation about phones in schools and any policy conversation, kind of there's a 5-part history. The first part I think is, go back to June 1st, 2007, pre-iPhone. If you would have walked into a college classroom or any place where cell phones were going to be ubiquitous, what you would have probably seen in that room are maybe a couple Blackberries, maybe a couple Nokias, but you mostly would have seen flip phones. And the best ones at that time had pretty decent screens-ish, had a nice camera on the outside for taking pictures, maybe a nice low-profile keyboard. And there was probably a web browser in it. You could click on it and go to foxnews.com or something like that if you wanted to. But once you got there, it was pretty clunky. You couldn't really navigate it. It took a long time to hit a link. So navigating the internet was not really an option.
They were really expensive too. And they had those ridiculous keyboards that were like physical keyboards that you had to like eat with like a toothpick and stuff. Yeah. It was very difficult.
Part 2 would have been June 29th, 2007, iPhone, the original iPhone rolled out. And by today's standards, it probably was a little rudimentary, but we have to remember it was the first time. It was a massive advancement in the technology where we were taking the highly tactile touchscreen and incorporating all the things that people wanted. The keyboard, the full keyboard, the camera, and web browsing. Much quicker, noticeably quicker web browsing, all in one package. Fast forward, 12 months to, I think, July 2008, the App Store comes out. And that was a big deal because once software development kits allowed third-party apps to be reliably downloaded onto phones, it created a massive, intense competition among companies to create the most engaging apps.
A couple things. And I love where you're going, right? Pre-iPhone, iPhone, and then the App Store. And this is a history that I've actually worked on with tech safety in general, trying to explain to people how we got to this point. And the iPhone, when it originally came out, I remember a friend of mine, actually the guy who got me involved in tutoring and education in the first place, he was like, yeah, you can go on Facebook, right? Back when Facebook was hot, right? And it was so clunky because the screen was small. We didn't have now we have mobile style HTML code, right? So it'll bring up a web page that's specific to a mobile phone. But before, you just had the web page, right? So everything was really small. You had to zoom in. It was very, very clunky. Once the App Store came out, I actually had a neighbor who I talked to extensively about the App Store, and his whole gig was finding dumb little app ideas that he would then send to his team in like India, and they would pump out these apps just for the pure reason is to get the 99 cents when somebody bought it, right? Because they hadn't quite developed the in-app purchase mechanisms yet. Right. And that's when everything became free. And it's like Fortnite. Hey, Fortnite's free, but you can buy this new skin. That's back when they were trying to get, 100,000 people to download an app that had a gerbil on the front. And you would say something into the phone and it would repeat it like, and make the gerbil's mouth move, and kids would laugh hysterically. This is also when you had things like Flappy Birds that were hyper addictive, so addictive that they actually removed them from the App Store because people were like crashing their cars and stuff playing Flappy Birds, like Anyway, yeah. So the introduction of the App Store was one of like the most fundamental. You inserted a level of global competition into the attention economy, where all of our attentions were the currency they were trading in, and they were all fighting for them.
That's right. So from the App Store, fast forward again, less than 2 years later, July 2010, the iPhone 4, the first front-facing camera, which corresponded and led a massive surge in user-created content. So the number of things that existed on the internet, once people were allowed to produce their own content, or they were always able to produce it, but once it became more ubiquitous because they were taking cameras of I'm taking pictures of you, me at the same time, the amount of user-created content went through the roof. Less than 2 years later, I think this is kind of the last part of the important part of the history, April 2012, Meta buys Insta. And that was when the beast was born. And I think that's the backdrop against which we are talking about phones in schools today, because when I say phones, and when most people say phones, we have to acknowledge we are talking about internet-enabled, camera-enabled, highly tactile phones filled with apps that have been designed to exploit weaknesses and lack of maturity in children.
I think that's a great breakdown. And I remember 2012 when they bought Insta, and I talked to my friend Marcel, who's this engineer, and he's like, I don't understand. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. And we're like going through this whole, like, what is the money here? Like, what are they doing? Why would they? Because they bought it for $1 gajillion. And it's like, you literally just take a picture and put a filter on it, and that's it. But that was the start of augmented reality and augmented perception as we really knew it, which is, hey, I have this draw to take a picture of myself, record every single bite of sushi I've ever had, right? And take pictures of myself with my friends, and then I have to make it look better. And that comparative personality draw is just exploded exponentially.
Indeed. So that's the situation we're faced with today, is kids in schools with, let's be honest, their computers more than their phones. I mean, when was the last time you saw a minor holding their smartphone to their ear to have a conversation, a voice conversation with someone? They're mostly used as computers and not phones. That's the situation we're faced with. That's the public policy problem that I think schools and community members are trying to push back against and address. So
there are a lot of problems that people think about when they think about phones. I have a friend. It's hilarious. The addictive nature of the phone is remarkable. His in-laws came up to visit for one of his kids' birthdays. Okay. And he sends a video. We're on a group text. He sends a video. He's like, they can't get off their phones. And I'm expecting it to be his kids. It's his in-laws. And they're all sitting on the couch. These, gray-haired older people sitting there with their iced tea, like scrolling through Facebook or scrolling through Insta, whatever it might be. So there's that problem. And most parents that I speak to are bothered by that. But that's where the risk for them ends, which is, okay, this is annoying. They're addicted to it. Like they're just frustrated with the state of the world. But the danger doesn't really end there. It doesn't even come close to ending there. What is actually happening is, if you're addicted to something, what will you do with it, right? What will you do to maintain it? What will you do to preserve it? What will you do to get access to it? And what is it doing to you? Why are you addicted to it? That's where we come down the rabbit hole to the different apps that are created, that all they want is to get your kids on them for longer and longer and longer, and feature your children as a product to adults. Now, this could be less nefarious, like, hey, I'm just marketing some product, but it absolutely does not end with good faith business transactions.
Right.
You're dealing with people that are intentionally getting on specific applications that are adults that do not have honorable intention, that are just looking for kids all day, every day, worldwide.
That's correct. And you know, to the adults sitting on a couch during vacation, you know, schools cannot control for every scenario, but phones in schools is a particularly big problem because of what it's doing to both instruction and learning and the learning environment. So on the instruction side, what you have are scenarios where, you know, if you're allowing kids to possess their phones and they're supposed to be off or something like that, what you are turning is phone policing into a full-time job that befalls teachers. That's not sustainable. When you talk about the learning environment side, I mean, yes, they're distracting. Kids are addictive, but they're also tools used in bullying quite commonly, thus further disrupting the learning environment. Once you get away from phones as you know, thoughtfully designed educational tools, or emergency tools, you know, or diabetes monitor, health monitoring tools, once you get aside from that, the value of smartphones and internet-enabled phones in a classroom is pretty low. The value is pretty low. And I think schools are realizing that by removing them from the environment, there's a lot of benefits.
Here's a question for you. Yeah. And this is a tricky one to flush out. Phones as a mechanism for emergency connectedness. This is really a double-edged sword. When House Bill 415 came up last year from Representative Hill that talked about arming teachers, there was a large consideration. I spoke to lots of SROs and different law enforcement people and education people, and one of the concerns is, hey, look, in an emergency, we need everyone's attention, right? In an emergency, we can't have 30 kids on a cell phone. We need 30 kids, eyes locked on the teacher, listening to what's going on. If 30 kids are on their phones screaming and yelling with their parents, as I know I would be if my kid called me or something like that, it will delay and prevent effective emergency response. So what do we do about that?
What we can do is a couple of things. One, and I don't think this is anyone's desire because we don't want to undermine the amount of preparedness and prevention that goes into preventing school shootings and dealing with them, but they're so statistically unlikely that allowing cell phones to perpetuate and compromise the learning environment because something that is unlikely might happen and we want to be prepared for that, I don't find to be the most persuasive argument. Secondly, another thing we can do is we can acknowledge what you just said, which is the fact that, and this is someone from, you know, who wrote a doctoral dissertation about incident management, has maintained some, you know, incident command system lower level certifications. I would argue that a school is rendered, and the people inside of a school are rendered less safe if during an emergency, kids are calling and texting rather than listening to the adult or an adult and maintaining situational awareness. Like you said, if something bad is happening, the last thing you want are 30 people trying to communicate with the outside world rather than performing their practiced and predetermined steps in the incident management plan that hopefully everyone will be familiar with and is ready to execute if it happens.
But what do we do, right? Because look, anybody who's ever been at a dinner table with teenagers that have their cell phones, you can relate to the struggle of a teacher with 30 kids or 20 kids in a classroom. It's like you can't get people to focus on conversation. You can't get them to focus on their food if they have their phones. So if, you know, at my house, like we don't even have tech anymore. We took away everything. But if my kids had phones, it's like, for sure, you can't have that phone at the dinner table. Absolutely not, because it's going to detract from this. So let's start with the assumption that people can relate. They're like, yeah, listen, cell phones in class, not a great thing. And if teachers are focusing on, you know, enforcing, you know, or dealing with cell phones, it's going to distract from their ability to teach the other students in the classroom. But how do we flush this out? Like, what's the position that is prudent for school districts to take? What are the mechanisms and processes that benefit us so that we can mitigate or minimize that distraction, but also not eliminate completely the very limited but very significant utility, for instance, health monitoring, right? Like you don't want to say no cell phones completely. And, even though diabetes and insulin monitoring is just a very limited example, there are valuable things. And like I send my kids to school every day with a gizmo watch. Right. And it's in a little pouch and they're not to take it out. They don't get to mess around with it. The watch can only call, I think, like 4 people. And they have that. So, if we're at pickup or something and, they're not seeing us, they can call us or they check it every day when they come out of school to make sure we haven't left them a message or something. So I understand as a parent the utility of having a way to connect with my kid. But at the same time, what's the policy? What's the ask from the schools and how do we explain that ask to parents?
Well, I think what's been happening in Idaho is probably the best possible way at this point, which is, the politicians and bureaucrats in Boise stay out of it and the local districts engage in these conversations at the local level and then draw conclusions and draft policies based on the desires of the local community. And the restrictions have ranged from, like we said earlier, you can keep your phone, students just turn them off and I don't want to see them. And, we put the policing on the teachers, all the way to, the most restrictive policies, which are what you might call bell-to-bell policies. Like you won't have access to your phone from the opening bell all the way until the last bill of the day. Letting districts continue to chew on which policy might be the best fit is probably the best call. Personally, I actually don't have a problem with phones in schools.
What does that mean?
Yeah, what it means is that what I have a problem with is internet and camera enabled smartphones in schools, which means, my kids share a old flip phone so that if they want to take off and go into the neighborhood, they can still communicate.
Sure.
Whenever they want, wherever they want, but they are not distracted and their time and attention and situational awareness is not being captured by apps or anything on the phone. So in that situation, would I be okay if every kid in the class had a flip phone? I think I would be, but then you still might encounter a situation where there's an emergency and every kid still having a flip phone doesn't alleviate the fact that they might not be paying attention in an emergency. These are just the natures of complex public policy discussions. It's not black or white. There's no secret button that if you find it, everything will get fixed. We just have to advance this conversation on the merits with the facts, what the best available research suggests, and go from there.
So if the implementation and policy for each district is left up to the district, right? The government closest to the people is the best, right? That's a very, I really like that sentiment, right? Limited government and government closest is the best. What do we say at the state level? Like, what's the ask that would be appropriate to help Idahoans and position Idaho as a front runner yet again with policy that says, hey, look, all these other states are struggling with this. This is what we're going to ask the districts to do. Is it to ask the districts, hey, have a policy, whatever you think that policy may be, whether it's bell to bell, whether it's with a vault, whether it's this can never be seen in class, whatever it is, enact a policy that you feel will meaningfully reduce the distraction of these, internet-enabled camera devices, whatever that policy may be. Or is it, we want you to do this, figure out how you're going to do that. Like, we want you to have a quote unquote, like, no cell phone policy.
Yeah.
Right. What is it?
I think the state has 2 rules, and maybe there's more, but just based on my understanding of our legislature and our general governing political philosophy, I think the state has 2 avenues. The first one is, should the legislature, for example, where I work, should we acknowledge that there is a public policy problem when you allow 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds to have internet-enabled, camera-enabled, highly tactile touch phones on their person in school?
Wait, okay. You have a 9-year-old. I assume the 9-year-old goes to an elementary school.
Correct.
Great. Have you not picked up that, you 14, we're talking like 7, 8, 9-year-olds with iPhones at school. This is not like a high school problem. This is elementary at every stage. Right. And even if you're not dealing with personal consumer electronics that you bring, the elementary kids in many districts in the area are given, Chromebooks and tech from the school itself. So this is not, I don't know if you were pointing out specifically 14, 15, 16-year-olds just like because we're thinking about high school, but this is an overwhelming problem even at the elementary level.
You're right, and I think that's one of my biases. I spend a lot of time trying to read the best available research, and the best available research generally focuses on phones and social media and apps once you start getting to, the teen and tween years. So I tend to not think so much about the thought of giving my 9-year-old a smartphone. I wouldn't think of that. But I think there's a role for the state to say, we think it's a problem when these types of devices are so omnipresent in the learning environment. Teachers can't teach, students can't learn. They're using them to bully each other. This is undermining our investment in public schools when they're so inefficient and ineffective because of these singular devices.
Yes.
I think there's a role for the legislature to explicitly say, yeah, we think there's a public policy problem. I think the second role that we might need to play, and I don't know, is if districts, and all of the evidence suggests that more and more districts are going to continue to restrict, smartphones and internet-enabled phones in schools. I think we should support those districts for whom implementation costs might be prohibitive. And by that, I mean, there might be districts that want to restrict these phones, but for some reason that, we don't know or we can't know, they don't have the $500 or $1,000 it's going to take to get lockers to put on the back of the doors like they do in West Ada, where all the kids drop their phones off when they come into the classroom.
The vault.
Maybe they don't have that money. Is the state going to allow districts to fail to adopt these policies because they don't have the money, or do we think the state might be willing to put a couple dollars aside so that these districts have this option as well? I would hope that, given that hypothetical, we would also put a few dollars aside to help support those implementation costs.
Gotcha. So essentially what it sounds like you're saying, hey, look, the state's job is to kind of figure out, like, is this a policy? Like, if we acknowledge there's an issue, is this an issue that even should be addressed in the legislature? And if it is an issue that we think, regardless of whether it should be addressed in the legislature or not, to the degree that districts want to address it on their own, is there a financial support that we can provide them, or we should provide them? Because obviously you can provide support, but is that the role of the state government at this point to do?
I think the answer is yes. I think it's totally within the legislature's purview to say, we're not going to tell you what to do, school districts, but for those school districts that want to address a problem we've acknowledged, we will make some monies available to you. If they're available, and, assuming they're not that much, we will make them available to you, because we don't want you to fail to protect kids and improve the school climates because you don't have this money. I think that's within the state's purview, especially if the state isn't going to say, you have to do this, you have to do that. And states have been coming online. Florida, Ohio have laws that say you got to restrict the phones. Pennsylvania has law that says, not only do you have to restrict the phones, but we're going to create a pilot program for you. Then you can have money to buy pouches and do all the things. I think Idaho is well positioned to follow the lead of the local districts, talk to them about how the state might be helpful. But at this point, I don't think the state telling districts what to do is helpful. I think if they need some help, we should provide it. If they need a little bit of money to buy volts or whatever, within reason, I think making some funds available. Though I would say just giving out money itself is not necessarily helpful. I think if the state were going to give out funds, I think there are some things we could do to make sure that the money is actually having the intended effect. There's no research right now that says just getting smartphones out of classrooms is, correlated or even causal to better learning outcomes. There's no research that says that. All of the anecdotal and, qualitative observational research suggests that kids are talking to each other again, they're playing again, and bullying is going down. That's great. But I think if the state is going to invest resources in these efforts at the local district, one of the things we should expect is some sort of report back from the district as to whether they think, restricting phones led to the outcomes they sought.
So do you think that having that type of information or evidence for a course of action is necessary in the face of overwhelming, anecdotal evidence, both in and out of school? I mean, we all know when you take tech away from kids are better. Like, nobody has ever reported that kids are better with a cell phone in their hand. And, I appreciate where you're coming from, which is, hey, let's really be cautious with taxpayer dollars. There's no way the state of Idaho should be pumping out money just because somebody said it was a good idea.
Right.
And like, God bless you. I respect that.
Mm-hmm.
I just think this is such a black and white thing. And maybe it is just for me,
right.
but what do you think about that?
The short answer to your question is no. I don't think the state should require, multiple peer-reviewed studies showing high correlations between variables to
double blind
to determine whether programs should continue. I think in this particular instance, what we want to know is after you restricted phones, and we made some funds available to you to do that. Again, this is all hypothetical. Did it lead to any outcomes that you had saw? If they come back and they're like, no, we didn't actually see any differences. Kids were still mean. There was still the same amount of fights. Then, maybe we sunset the program. We don't make the funds available. Maybe they come back and they're like, no, there was noticeable differences. And, we didn't hire a bunch of PhDs to do a quantitative study, but we definitely measured some things over time. And what we found is X or Y. I think that's within reason. I don't think you need to require proof. Just evidence is helpful.
That's super reasonable. Yeah. Super reasonable. For states like Florida, okay, that have implemented actual laws at the state level, why is that not the right thing for Idaho? Like, why not just take whatever they said? It's like what Florida said, ditto, right? Why not just take that and put that out here? And I'm not asking you to talk about all the nuances of the law. Obviously, I don't expect you to know that. But why not? I get it that you're saying, hey, it's our job to acknowledge, but like, why not drop the hammer on this? We had an issue with libraries over the last several sessions, right? Where the state did come in and say, hey, for public safety, essentially, and the safety of our minors and whatnot, we're going to take this action. Now, there is plenty to be said about the library problem. There's plenty to be said about the different revisions and the punitive nature and, fines, no fines, different areas, no different areas, public school libraries or just public libraries. There's a lot. Okay, so we don't need to dive into that. But the state did step up and say, this is the new law and it does affect on the local level. Why not? Why is it a bad idea to do something like that with this?
Well, I'm not 100% sure it's a bad idea. I would say a fundamental difference is that, I didn't think there's a bona fide library problem. I had never had a constituent come to me and say, hey, this library, made this book available to a child and then something bad happened to the kid. That had never come to me. So I wasn't sure there was a problem. So in the context of problems, I'm not sure focusing on phones in schools is necessarily the best place to start. I think there are more reputable avenues in which there's a strong statutory basis for getting involved. For example, there is a federal law that says students or children who are 13 and younger can't be on social media. There's a federal law that says that. But if you've ever run a test on setting up an Instagram account, that the age verification process is a joke. I think there's a role for the state of Idaho to start enforcing or requiring that law be enforced more sincerely so that we don't have 11, 10, 9, 12-year-old kids on social media, especially with the research that is coming back about the effects of social media, especially on our girls.
Listen, I make it 16. Like I like what you're saying, but how do we do that? Like one of the biggest problems that we encounter in this conversation over and over and over is you don't have $1 million. You don't have $1 billion. You have a $1 trillion industry that does not want you to do that. So how do we start? Senator Cook last year had a bill that he was trying to get passed that talked about the toggle switch on a smartphone to indicate that it was in ownership of a minor, right? When somebody buys a personal consumer electronic, there's a switch. I don't even know how to find the switch in reality. And he was like, it should be automatically switched to, minor if it's being sold to a minor or something like that. Like the tech industry came down on Idaho like a dump truck on a cockroach. Like they swooped in from on high and like crushed every chance that Idaho had. And we're like a 2 million population state. Why does anybody care? It's because of the precedence that starts getting set. I love what you're saying, which is, hey, let's take it on as a state to meaningfully enforce age verification and ensure that our young people are protected from the horrors of social media. I have a neighbor who has 4 girls, and she has gone through hell with her girls. We're talking, she has 2 older that I think are 22 and 20, and then 2 younger. And the 22 and 20, if you put the timelines around correctly, they went through the phase where we didn't know how bad it was. And those 2 girls were like, it was hell. As adults now, they can look back on it and say, like, there is no justification for putting young people through this. And she's attempting, my neighbor, who's awesome, is attempting to help her younger kids with it. And it's a train wreck, right? I love this, but how? Like, how does Idaho do this?
Well, I think Idaho, like any state or any legislature, the way you do anything is you make sure there is consensus and unanimity on the existence of a very specific, solvable problem. And based on what I hear you saying, I'm curious to know what percentage of Idahoans think the lack of meritorious age verification on new social media accounts is a problem. It sounds like plenty. I finished reading a book recently called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And the book almost was entirely focused on what he calls the great rewiring, this period from 2010 to 2015. I was talking about all the phone enhancements. Depression rates went up 2.5 times in prevalence during the Great Rewiring. Between 2010 and 2020, self-harm rates for American girls nearly tripled. I think we can say there's a problem. And so I think what Idaho can do is start moving the needle on identifying problems. I think that's one of the most underestimated values of resolutions and memorials, particularly resolutions. Resolutions are an opportunity for groups of legislators to come together and say, we think there's a real problem. And this resolution expresses this position of the legislature, thus laying the foundation for what is kind of the next step in the heuristics model of public policy making, which is after you've identified the problem, then you get to have a conversation around, well, what are all of the options available to us to address that problem?
I love that. I did not, you just taught me something. I did not know that there is a formal process of like, hey, let's all get on the same page and at least acknowledge, hey, this is a problem, right? I don't have a solution yet. Let's just resolve that this is an issue. And then we can have a broader conversation about how to solve this issue. But if we can't get on the same page with that there is a problem and this is the problem, you obviously can't work towards a solution.
Correct. And I think historically in my, I've had 4 sessions under my belt. Resolutions I have found have historically been used to divide us and like get people on the record to say something.
You got to pick a side.
I call them trap votes. They're trap votes.
Any chance I could get an example? What's a trap vote?
An example of a trap vote. I mean, shoot, if you go look at all of the resolutions that have been passed in the last 4 years and go look at how many of them passed along party line vote, that and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I think that would be pretty indicative of what the trap votes are. The Republican leadership wants to make sure they get, their members on the record on certain positions. I mean, the ranked choice vote, I don't know if that was a resolution, but the prohibition on ranked choice voting, I think it was a bill. I don't think it was a resolution, but there's a lot of resolutions like that. I see a future where we use resolutions to bring people together around very specific, concrete problems so that we can all get on the same page. And then what we're doing is we're signaling to everybody else in the state, hey, we just identified a problem. I want everybody to put their thinking caps on and figure out what are our options for fixing this. And then we will come back and we will move the needle and then we will implement something. And then we will evaluate how implementation went and we will feed back the lessons learned into the whole process and we'll start over. I think we can get there.
So what you're envisioning here is more of, in this coming session, a resolution to like, hey, let's all get on the same page that cell phone access, or not, as you put it, internet enabled with camera ready, like technology in schools is a problem, right? Or is to some degree can impede the learning environment.
I think so, but also it's quite possible that, and I haven't talked to all of my House colleagues about this. It's quite possible that everyone in the House is like, oh no, Matt and Chris are right on this one. It's a serious problem. So let's just move on to the next phase.
Start to solve.
And then you start talking about bills and cracking open different sections of code and figuring out what are our options. I think we might be there. That's what my gut tells me. But again, I think regardless, if you go look at all the school districts, from West Ada and Twin and Blaine, if you go look at the districts that have adopted these restrictions on smartphones in schools, they tend to have the same elements of pushback, which is the emergency argument. How do I get a hold of my kid in an emergency? And really, there's two different kinds of emergency. There's the emergency that isn't, imminent threat, time sensitive. In those instances, you just call the front desk like you did.
Right.
Time in memoriam, and they will get your child for you. Get them on the phone. So I think moving forward, I think Idaho is at a position where we're ready for some actual action. I think we know there's a problem. I think we need to be pretty crystal clear on what the problem is, and I don't think we want to over legislate. I think we just need to be supportive of the districts that are in the business of trying to do the right thing for their kids under their purview on a day in, day out basis.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
Here we are talking about this, and you're saying, hey, the House may already be at the point where they're on board. They may already have the position, like other people may have been doing their own research and it's like, yeah, look, let's move on. But if they're not, you're talking about like a multi-step, multi-year potentially issue. And like people bring like the library bill, whether you like it or love it, doesn't matter to me. But that was a multi-year thing that people kept going back and they'd work it and they worked the bill and they worked the bill to work the bill. And then, a bunch of different revisions, some coming out of the House, some coming out of the Senate. You have all these different things. Like, how do you, just from a practical standpoint, how do you consider the things you're going after as attainable versus potentially unattainable? Because, you have a 2-year term and then you have to run for re-election. You are running for re-election. You're running unopposed. So that's nice. You don't have to worry about that. But like, do you ever moderate the things you go after in thinking that it would take too long to show the work I've been doing, or it would take too long and I potentially might not make it? Do you ever, pull back on your kind of audacious goals?
I don't. And the reason I don't is because I tend to focus on things that I believe are widely viewed public policy problems. So Chris Mathias' replacement is just going to take the baton and keep running with it, because it's not a personal, passion pet project of mine. It's, I knock 100 doors. X percentage of the doors I knock said, yeah, this is a problem. Those are the things I'm working on. So if I'm not working on it, the person that comes after me will be working on it. So I don't slow down. In fact, I continue to try to clear a hole for the person who's going to be coming with the ball after me, so that we're constantly moving down the field towards some sort of resolution.
Do you still knock doors and talk to people?
Yeah.
Really?
Sure.
What do people say? They're like, hey, Chris, I'm your rep.
It depends on where and when you knock. If you knock in a non-election year, which is my preference, when you get to go to someone's door and say, I'm not even here to ask for your vote. I'm just here because I'm your representative in the legislature. Do you have concerns? Are there things you wish we were talking about?
Feedback? What can we do here?
9 times out of 10, people are going to say no, some variation of no. Thanks for stopping by. This is great. I don't. Or, I'm shocked you're even here, but I got to get back to the football game.
Right.
9 times out of 10, that's what you get. 8 times out of 10 in an off year. But every once in a while, you get a real heady issue that comes to you. In fact, one of my bills from last session came from off-year door knocking. I knocked on a door of a constituent in precinct 1908, which is a precinct I lost, by the way, in my last election. I wasn't even their preference, but I was going there because they're still my constituents. I still have an obligation to serve them. And I knocked on one gentleman's door and I said, do you have any? He said, I actually do. And he proceeded to tell me this nightmare story of his architecture firm having to deal with the Department of Administration, the Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing, in how they bid on the new women's prison. Long story short, that was a problem that came to be my knocking on doors, established consensus, and we got a bill passed this year, signed into law, that fixes that makes sure that local Idaho architectural firms are no longer at a competitive disadvantage against the big architectural national firms that can just draw from pools of architects all over the country, which is what they were doing. And so now everyone who bids on a public works project in Idaho, the architectural firm has to have a team that is going to be supervised by someone with an Idaho license.
Look at you. So you're just connecting to the people.
It's just the job.
That's awesome. I know you do a lot of work on social media, right? Like you put out your weekly updates. I've seen those. Do you get a lot of communication back and forth on that platform? Do you get people reaching out to you saying, hey, thanks for putting this up. Like, this is a concern of mine, or can you please look into this?
You know, my Monday morning legislative preview doesn't generally trigger a lot of requests for particular services because it's just not what it's designed for.
Sure.
But I get countless thank yous from people who thank me for providing information that is forward looking, which was the whole motivation behind the Monday morning legislative preview. Is almost all of us put out newsletters at the end of the week. Newsletters are backward looking. And I wanted to add something else for the people of Idaho, people who are very busy, raising kids, running ranches, doing all the things. And so what I get a lot of are thank yous. Like, even if I disagreed with your position on that one thing, the whole purpose of the video is just like, this bill's going to be here on Tuesday or Wednesday. This bill's going to be there. You can testify or you can't testify. Or it's just information. This is all about just putting real factual information in front of people so that they can maybe plan a little bit of their week if they want to participate in the legislative process.
The reason I asked is because obviously communication with constituents and communication between elected officials and those who voted them in, or just voters in general, is so crucial, right? Because when you have that disconnect, you know, as a voter, I don't know what's going on. I don't know who's pulling strings. I'm much more susceptible to misinformation if I don't have access or information coming from the actual person making votes or whatever it might be. And if you're saying, hey, look, the best way for me to do it is door knocking, it's like, with all the communication technology we have, how come door knocking gets the most like participation? How come there need to be better? I would hope that there were some form of better communication routes or communication channels, but it sounds like the social media is not really it. And, you know, like town halls, you probably get limited. I know you guys generally do some town halls.
Sure.
You get good turnout there.
We do. I mean, granted, the Capitol building is in my district. I have really high information voters. Voting rates in my district are higher than the state average by far. So I just have a type of constituency that's ready to consume information. So when I knock on doors, I'm pretty excited about what I'm going to hear.
Gotcha.
And I think just going back to the old school versions of this type of communication are quite often the best. Though social media, virtual tools also have a tremendous amount of value. I suspect that things, and I've had this thought before, but I suspect that things are different for me in particular because I'm a Democrat and I'm a member of a legislative super minority. A majority of my conversations with constituents just walking on the streets, when they have a complaint, they almost always preface it with, you probably can't do anything about this, Chris, because they know the dynamic within which I work.
Right.
It's probably different though for people who hold gavels and people who have are closer to the head of power. They probably do get a lot more requests to do this, to do that over social media than I get.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Man, we've talked about a lot of things.
That we have.
Do you, again, cell phones, we have other priorities, you have other priorities in this coming year, but we were specifically hitting cell phones. Is there anything else you want to hit today?
No, nothing else I want to hit today other than to just say, I really love coming on the show.
Love having you.
It is a great reminder that, no one person knows everything, and that through, the conversations that follow the rules of reason to discourse, you can elevate your understanding of things, make you a little more empathetic to things, make you a little more sympathetic to things. And I think that always leads to a better, more healthy legislative process, at least one that most Idahoans can look on and say, that's my legislature. That's a good legislature right there.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. And again, there's so much of I'm a communication nerd, and there's so much of in my mind, a problem that needs to be addressed with how people want to consume information and how information is presented.
Yep.
And so trying to at least offer some kind of genuine conversation in a manner that people want to consume it is a big piece. So thank you for coming in and being part of that.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. See you next time.